It is a world-shattering historical period known by most, yet understood by few. It happened at a time when the fate of Gielinor seemed unquestionable. Yet, one being would challenge this notion and forever alter this land's future. The resulting story would be one of vicious betrayal, bitter rivalries, and unrelenting violence. A dark saga, infamous for bringing about suffering, bloodshed, and devastation on an unfathomable scale unheard of before, or since. This is the tale of the God Wars, when Gielinor was torn apart and left forever scarred. The end of the Second Age. History does not happen in a vacuum. To understand the events of the God Wars, also simply known as the Third Age, we must rewind to the previous one. By the end of the Second Age, the clearly dominant power on Gielinor was the god Zaros and his vast empire. Overlaid onto today's maps, it would include the entirety of the Wilderness, the kingdoms of Asgarnia and Mistalin, the cities of Wace, Al-Kharid and Canifus, and even more. Its capital of Senntisten was arguably history's largest and most prosperous city, a title only the elvish capital of Privdinus could hope to challenge. It seemed the Zarosian Empire was destined to dominate Gielinor, but unbeknownst to Zaros, one of his closest accomplices had other ideas in mind. Zamorak, today one of 3 major gods, but back then merely a Majorat, had managed to become the highest-ranking general in Zaros' army. Driven by his unquenchable thirst for power, he began making plans to overthrow his master and seize his domain for himself. Zamorak weaved a web of high-ranking traitors among Zaros' ranks, securing their loyalty with promises of land once their ruler was usurped. But even their combined strengths would be insufficient to achieve their goals, for defeating a god among gods is no small feat. But it seemed fate was sympathetic to Zamorak's treacherous schemes. Through a combination of deceit and sheer luck, he managed to acquire relics whose incredible power made even the gods tremble: the Stone of Jas and the Staff of Armadil. The Zarosian betrayers knew there would never come a better opportunity. As his co-conspirators distracted the bodyguards of their forsaken lord, Zamorak plunged the staff in Zaros' back. But even with this initial advantage, a difficult battle ensued. In another unexpected stroke of luck for the traitor, the Staff of Armadil allowed him to destroy Zaros and transfer much of his immense power to himself during the struggle. The plan had worked. History's most powerful ruler had been usurped. The other gods of the land did not take kindly to the slaying of one of their own by a mortal, however. Zamorak was banished from this world by Saradominist, Armadil, and possibly others. With Zaros destroyed and many of his followers now loyal to Zamorak, the gods fixed their rapacious eyes on the Zarosian Empire's headless carcass, eager to pick at it like opportunistic vultures. They did not yet know the flames of Zaros' power still burned bright within his banished betrayer. The spark created by Zamorak that day had ignited the gods' war machines. As they sprung to life, the stage was set for a new era, an age of grinding conflict, and thus the Third Age was ushered in. Some quick notes before we begin. Many details of the events of the Third Age have been lost to history. While we know it lasted about 4,000 years, the timing of much of what happened is unclear at best. I have done my utmost to present the God Wars in a timeline, but be aware that much of it is speculative, and the order of events in this video is almost certainly inaccurate to some extent. And one last thing before we begin with the God Wars proper, allow me to briefly introduce you to the main belligerent factions, each associated with their respective god. The Zarosian loyalists, who tried to hold together what was left of the empire after the demise of Zaros. The Saradominists, who saw Zaros' death as an opportunity for expansion. Their main stronghold is the kingdom of Hallowvale, which at the time spanned most of today's Mauritania. The Zamorakians, composed of those who joined Zamorak in his plot against Zaros, those who defected to his side, and those he recruited in other worlds before his eventual return to Gielinor. The Bandosians, a collection of mostly aggressive and intellectually limited races. Bandos, the god of war, fought solely for fighting's sake, and valued obedient creatures that would lay down their lives without question. His followers were scattered across the Feldip hills. The Armadillians, who seemed uninvolved in most of the major events of the God Wars, possibly more preoccupied with constant attacks from Bandos's minions. It's unclear which parts of Gielinor they dwelled in, but some evidence points to them ruling the skies and/or parts of today's Kandarin region. And last but not least, Gielinor's main god Guthix deserves a short introduction too. Most Guthixians tend towards pacifism and would not have a significant role in the God Wars. Guthix himself had been in a deep slumber and therefore uninvolved in Gielinor affairs for thousands of years before the events of the Third Age, but he deserves a mention here, just in case he has something to do with the God Wars at some point. Oh, and the Elves had their own goddess Seren. She's going to come up once or twice. But with the general context and this little foreshadowing out of the way, the time has finally come. The God Wars begin. The fate of Zamorak's artifacts. Zamorak, the God Slayer, had been banished, but Saradomin and Armadil could not yet rest. The balance of power on Gielinor had been turned on its head, and they had to move quickly to exploit this unexpected blessing. They both rushed to secure the powerful relics used for Zaros's destruction. Armadil claimed the staff, hiding it away in the Temple of Ikov, and founding the Guardians of Armadil. This new order was tasked with protecting the staff. The Guardians of Armadil would go on to survive all the way to the current 5th Age, where they are some of the last known Armadil worshippers on all of Gielinor. Saradomin, for his part, would exploit the Zarosians' confusion and uncertainty following the sudden death of their god, to seize the Stone of Jas right from under their noses in their capital of Senntisten. 2 Justiciars, Saradomin's most elite order of knights, are sent to hide the stone at the bottom of the Eastern Sea. The warriors, Aliyah and Zakaria, 2 of the strongest Justiciars, take a small force with them and make their way there. They are kept in the dark about the artifact's true nature, only being told it's an item called Saradomin's Eye. They erect a temple to house and defend it, christening it the Temple of the Eye. Very important events of the early Third Age would play out in the temple, and we will be returning to it shortly. Nexus Prison, Part 1. Among all the mortal races on Gielinor, one stood out for its mysterious and fearsome reputation. They would perform rare rituals at a forlorn shrine somewhere in the mountains, southeast of modern-day wastes. These sacred rituals allowed their kin to rejuvenate themselves, but at a cost. One of them would randomly be sacrificed each time. These ancient and formidable magic users were the Majorats. While their race had long been aligned with Zaros, some of them had now renounced their old allegiance and defected to their kinsman Zamorak's side. As the Second Age gave way to the Third, the Zarosians realized the strategic importance of securing their ritual site, ensuring only their allies could make use of it. Nex, one of the most powerful beings in all of Gielinor, personally led an army to occupy it. Her already immense power was rumored to grow every time she fought, and her name would often be heard among her enemies' ranks, followed by hushed claims of her invincibility. Saradomin's forces, acutely aware of the great threat that Nex and her army posed, wished to take this frightening piece off the board entirely. They enacted a cunning plan, luring the Zarosian army in the mountains to the south and into a large cavern. There, at the cost of massive casualties, they successfully cast a powerful enchantment spell that froze their foes and put them in a prolonged magical sleep. This part of the cavern became the ancient prison. They built a temple in the frozen cave complex, the Temple of Lost Ancients. Thousands of years later, it would be known under a different name, the God Wars Dungeon. While this site would remain undisturbed for generations, its role in the Third Age is far from over. The Concealment of the Elder Horn. The confused Zarosian forces were in disarray. Their leader had unexpectedly been felled, and 2 of their great relics had been taken by the enemies. But not all of them. Still in their possession was the Elder Horn, which was said to allow its owner to exert absolute control over anything. Perseria, a siren in Zaros's Praefectus classis, meaning Admiral of the Navy, was tasked with the hiding of the horn. She organized a convoy and had it sent to the Far East, possibly to the Wushanko Isles, faraway lands where her race originated from. Unbeknownst to those involved, the whole operation was a cover. The horn the convoy carried was a fake, the real one being kept in the Admiral's personal cabin for a short while. However, a more secure location for the artifact was in order. Perseria made her way to the Caridian desert, where stood the ancient vault, arguably the most secure structure on all of Gielinor. She stored the horn behind its nigh impenetrable doors, sealing it inside. One could only hope to unseal it by practicing Zarosian magic and possessing 4 medallions. These effective key fragments she then entrusted only to some of the most loyal, powerful, and highest-ranking members of the Shattering Empire. One she gave to the Whisperer, a fellow siren whose true title and identity were highly enigmatic and classified. One was handed over to Duke Sucellus, formerly the commander of a legion of demons, but now acting commander of all remaining Zarosian forces after Zamorak's defection. One for Vardorvis, a vampire with the rank of Carnifex Maximus, meaning the Empire's executioner. The last one she kept for herself. With the horn now secured, they all went their separate ways. Vardorvis and the Whisperer headed to the fortress of Lassar. Duke Sucellus eventually made for Ghorrock in the northwestern edge of Forentry province, today the Wilderness, and Perseria returned to her navy. Some pretty horrifying destinies would await all 4 members of this group, but worry not, all of their fates will be revealed in due time. The Battle of the Eye and the Opening of the Scar. From her flagship, Perseria's gaze swept across the still sea. Saradomin's justiciars had secured the Stone of Jas. However, one does not move an artifact of such power and interest without attracting unwanted attention. Zarosian intelligence had caught wind of its new underwater location off the coast of Hallowvale. The Admiral snapped out of her daydreaming. Her navy had a crucial mission to accomplish. The Empire would reclaim their prized possession. Approaching the temple called for subtlety to avoid the Saradominists quickly sending reinforcements from nearby Hallowvale. That being said, the Zarosians were well aware that their forces could never hope to best the legendary Justiciars without outnumbering them. The small force necessary for a stealthy operation simply would not do the trick. To put the odds in her favor, Perseria devised a simple plan. She would lead a small contingent and infiltrate the temple, then use powerful magic to summon a large force into the temple and bring the fight to the Justiciars. Once the reinforcements were ready for their summoning, the infiltration force set sail. The group managed to reach the temple and catch its garrison by surprise. As expected, their fighting abilities were no match for the Justiciar defenders, but Perseria was optimistic. No matter the zeal and prowess of the enemy, her reinforcements would turn the tide. The hard part was already over. Or so she thought. For when she cast her spell, the magic was warped by the stone's own powerful magical aura. The incantation misfired, and instead of Zarosian troops, the combatants were greeted by a steadily growing rift to the scar, one of the most dangerous parts of the abyssal space. Both sides were thrown into disarray as abyssal monsters began pouring in, and the rift itself started swallowing the Zarosian navy. Perseria and her troops scrambled to retreat, but few ships managed to escape, and most of the navy was ultimately destroyed. Justiciar Alia used the stone's magic to seal the rift, and what was left of her forces dealt with the remaining otherworldly creatures. Realizing the great danger posed by an eventual reopening of the rift so close to Hallowvale, she created the Great Guardian along with lesser rune guardians to protect the temple should the seal ever be broken. The temple was no longer a safe location for Saradomin's eye, however, and so she had it moved to the mainland. But it turned out the Zarosians weren't the rift's only victims. It had also consumed a most unexpected being. The Leviathan. Little is known about this massive undersea creature, but it clearly adapted well to its new abyssal environment. It settled in a large lake of the Scar, where it seems it hunted down the unlucky survivors who shared its new home. There is little doubt as to Perseria's ultimate fate, as her broken ship washed up on the shore of this strange world, where it can still be found undisturbed to this day. And when the Leviathan would eventually be slain in the 5th Age, her medallion would be uncovered, having been swallowed by the beast a long time ago. Lassar falls to dwarves and darkness. Somewhere around what would today be northern Asgarnia, a derelict army is marching eastwards. What they are after is more precious than prisoners or riches, and more sacred than honor or loyalty. They seek a home, and they have been promised one on one condition: they must take it from the enemy. The army is what remains of the magic-wielding Imkando Dwarves, named after their place of origin far to the north of the mainland. Imkandoria, a great city that fell to the evil influence of a mysterious dark artifact near the end of the 2nd Age. Their destination is the Zarosian fortress of Lassar, a mighty stronghold on what is today called the Ice Mountain. A deal was struck with their ally Saradominist. If they drive the Zarosians from Lassar, their race has his blessing to settle it. At the head of this great host is a leader whose name you may be familiar with: Yonrith Lovakane. In Lassar itself, many important actors are at work. Not long before, a powerful Zarosian Majorat discovered an enigmatic totem deep in the Undercity. This Majorat is Slisk, and as a quick aside, you should remember his name because he is a very important figure. He is a powerful and mysterious being who will not only be pulling many strings during the God Wars, but also whose nebulous goals would many millennia later lead to some of the most important events of the 5th Age. Anyway, back to our story. Recognizing the power of the totem and its possible connection with the mysterious Shadow Realm, a hidden part of Gielinor, he had ordered for it to be studied by researchers. It was soon discovered that the totem allowed them to tap into the Shadow Realm's vast power. However, it was observed that the artifact radiated a dangerous energy that drove some to madness. As a result, Slisk cast a protective barrier to ensure the researchers' safety and assigned the Whisperer, who he claimed was an expert on the Shadow Realm, to lead the investigation. It's unclear if Slisk was right in this assumption, but he grew convinced that the totem was the same item that caused the downfall of Imkandoria. Therefore, when he was informed that the Imkando Dwarves were approaching, he wrongly assumed that they were after its destruction. Clinging to the hope that the totem's power could be harnessed, he orders for it to remain in the Lassar Undercity and for the Whisperer to perform further testing, giving her full control over the research team. Before long, the dwarves besieged the fortress. With time quickly running out, Slisk gives orders for the Undercity to be sealed, an order he had no authority to give, as only Lassar's High Magister was allowed to make such a critical decision. Undeterred by this legal hurdle, the Whisperer gives the order herself, claiming it came from the High Magister himself. To ensure the order is followed through and research can continue unrestrained, she murders the High Magister and the entire research team, then dissolves the totem's protective barrier with Slisk's assistance. The Dwarven army's siege would eventually succeed, and the fortress would be destroyed. The Imkando Dwarves would settle it, building a new city to call home over its ruins, and renaming it Kamdozal. Their city would survive the God Wars, but its inhabitants would remain forever unaware of the dark scenes occurring deep beneath their feet. There, in the sealed Undercity, the totem's influence would slowly spread. More and more of the sealed-off Zarosians would begin worshipping it, eventually adopting a collective name for their grim group, the Silent Choir. The corruption gripping their minds would grow so powerful over time that more and more of them would die in the large artifact's chamber, having worshipped it to death in order to reach what they called Ascension. The Whisperer, despite her iron will and incredible power, would not escape the tendrils of this dark influence, slowly going mad herself, until one day she submerged herself in the still waters of the now sunken Undercity Temple. She would remain beneath the surface until her long rest would eventually be disrupted in the 5th Age, at which point she would still be in possession of her medallion, unlike her mind. Those with the ability to cast ancient magics can use the Lassar teleport spell to end up on top of the ice mountain. The Lassar Undercity is mostly intact to this day, and if one casts the spell while inside, they may notice a little Easter egg. As for the artifact that caused so much damage, it still stands exactly where it did when the fortress fell, although today it is now known as the Ancient Pillar. The numerous skeletons dotting its chamber tell a grim tale of all the worshippers who died seeking ascension in this forsaken place. Kourend's refugees and the demise of Dwarves. A group of Imkando dwarves stopped their long march. The only sound reaching their ears is the bubbling of a nearby lava pool. Their leader eyes their environment, warm, peaceful, easily defensible, and most importantly, brimming with minerals. Buried under his old beard, Yonrith Lovakane's lips contort into a smile. This looks to him like a good place to call home. It's unclear when or why, but Yonrith Lovakane abandons his army at some point during the siege of Lassar, taking only his closest circle with him. Perhaps he had grown wary of war, or perhaps he thought the siege would fail. Whatever the case may be, his group set sail on the Western Sea until land was sighted. That day, Gielinor had its first contact with what would become known as Kourend. The dwarves did not realize that their great journey had seen another ship following in their wake. Leading the defenses of Lassar had been the Zarosian executioner Dwarves, a vampire who prided himself as someone his enemies could never escape from. When he was informed that the enemy leader had fled, he took it as a personal insult. Wishing to appease his delicate ego, Dwarves gathered a group of Venators, a class of elite Zarosian hunters and scouts. You may be familiar with them thanks to their famous bows. This contingent would give chase to Yonrith's party. Once on Kourend, they set camp in what is today the Stranglewood. Venators are dispatched to find Yonrith Lovakane and his allies. It would take 6 days for the scouts to locate their camp near the northwestern edge of this new continent. But the dwarven settlement wouldn't be their only find that day. One Venator took an interest in the local vegetation. He brought a particularly curious sample back to the Zarosian camp, presenting it to Dwarves. The executioner showed little interest in it, but his attitude changed once it became clear that what they thought was a strange plant was actually some kind of strange parasite which had infected him with some unknown ailment. He was the first ever being from Gielinor to be infected by what we know today as the Strangler, and he would find out the severity of its effects. His health seemingly unaffected for the time being, he began his preparations for the assault on the dwarven camp. He would never be given the chance to enact his plans. The dwarves discovered the location of his forces. The very next day, they attacked the Zarosians, leveraging the element of surprise to destroy them before they could react. While vampires were impervious to non-silver weaponry, the Strangler had suppressed Dwarves' innate immunities. The dwarves caught and beheaded him, a grimly ironic twist of fate for the Empire's highest executioner. Many more refugees would make their way west. It did not take long for new settlements to grow in size and organization. Yonrith Lovakane founded a dwarven city that still stands and bears his name, while humans made their own communities. The cities of Lovakane, Piscarilius, and Archaeus were born. You may have heard of them before, but southwest of this fledgling civilizations lay someone whose story had not ended with their death. The Strangler's roots spread through their body, reanimating a headless Dwarves. The infection would slowly conquer the area, earning it its future name, the Stranglewood. In today's age, it has acquired a foul reputation, that of a place no one ever comes back from. But if anyone did make it far enough, on this continent's westmost point, they may have run into the animated body of a long-dead vampire. still carrying an old medallion. Zamorak's return. The early years of the Third Age had brought many noteworthy events. The Zarosian Empire had been stabbed in the back and relentlessly undermined, but the battered realm was not at the end of its troubles. 17 years after the initial blow, its most painful wound would reopen long before it had a chance to heal, when Zamorak openly came back to Gielinor. Having now mastered the powers acquired from Zaros and secured armies from other worlds, he returned not as Zamorak the Majorat, but Zamorak, the God of Chaos. This event might be extremely short in the grand scheme of the God Wars, but make no mistake, it brings with it a new phase of the Third Age. Much of Zamorak's efforts would be dedicated to the undermining of Saradomin, who has been more than happy to return the favor ever since. However, no matter how deep their mutual hatred ran, it would never be as strong as the one they held towards their common enemy, the Zarosians. For the next several thousand years, the forces of Zamorak and Saradomin would attempt to completely wipe out everything even remotely related to Zaros in what is sometimes called the Zarosian extermination. Their forces would be in constant conflicts with each other, but would not hesitate to form temporary alliances of convenience if it meant precipitating the shattering of the empire. Many cities would be captured and completely destroyed. For example, the fortresses of Dariak and Anakarl, both destroyed at unknown dates. Today, the former is little more than a small pile of rubble near the western edge of the wilderness, while today's demonic ruins are all that the latter left behind. In other words, with Zamorak's return, the God Wars were ready to reach the scale and level of devastation they would forever be remembered for. The exodus of Dwarves, Elves, and Dorgeshuun. At this point, nobody on Gielinor could deny it. The dark days were far from over, and there was no hope of peace in sight. But not all peoples had the appetite for a bloody struggle or the grim determination to bear the risks and costs of war. Entire races fled the God Wars, deliberately shattering their way of life to escape the slaughter. First would be the common dwarves, who most likely used to live in villages the same way most humans did, but decided to go underground in the hope that the carnage of the surface would not reach them. They built massive mines and complex cities, adapting so well to this new lifestyle that even in today's mostly peaceful age, the biggest dwarven societies still dwell beneath the ground. Those who did not go underground instead made their way to the newly discovered lands to the west, settling in Lovacane with their Imcandario counterparts. But they were not the only race to look downwards for an escape. I've explained before that the god Barrows expected blind obedience from his worshippers and felt completely entitled to their lives. To him, they were nothing more than meals for the feeding of his most beloved beast, war. Many of the races under his guidance only barely had the capacity to understand his orders, let alone comprehending the futility and unfairness of their treatment. But that was not the case for all Bandosians. Among his followers was a race of physically unimpressive goblins. Yet, what these creatures lacked in brawn, they made up for in brains. They were the Dorgeshuun, and their empathy, combined with their sharp minds, would make them question everything. As they carried out their orders, they would begin asking, why? Why should either side have to suffer and die for the decisions of gods? They could not find an answer, and saw no reason to fight. So they deserted, all too aware of the consequences they would face should Barrows get to them. To avoid punishment, it's said they hid in a large hole where they intended to lay low for a while. But not long after, a powerful earthquake hit the land, and the only accessible exit suffered a catastrophic collapse. Yet, what may have been the end for a weaker race was a golden opportunity for the Dorgeshuun. Their ingenuity and adaptability allowed them not only to escape the horrors of war, but even to thrive. In a remarkable show of resilience, they would build an advanced society and culture amongst the most unique on Gielinor. Some may see it as a dishonorable act, but their desertion was unquestionably a great blessing for the future of their race. They would only re-establish contact with the surface in the 5th Age, where their history would earn them the widely known nicknames of Cave Goblins or the Lost Tribe among the surface races of a world completely unlike the one they escaped from. But that is a story for another day. Finally, the God Wars also displaced many of the Elves on Gielinor. Their kin had spread across Tirranon, which, by the way, is not at all how I thought it was pronounced before I did my research. When war began raging around them, they retreated to their ancient capital of Wilderness. Anxious at the idea of war reaching their walls, the Amlad clan built the Gauntlet, a training ground where the Elves could sharpen their combat and survival skills to prepare for conflict. But thanks to the Galarpos Mountains isolating them from the rest of Gielinor, and to their goddess Seren being more interested in their safety than in expansion or conquest, their race was unaffected by the worst stages of the 3rd Age. Well, almost. More on that later. Ghorrock Part 1 – The Secret Fortress. Far from their home, a human looks around with tired eyes. These walls are unfamiliar to them, and of all the things they have ever owned, they are only left with what they are carrying. Yet as the gates shut behind them, they let out a sigh of relief. They may have lost everything else, but they are finally reunited with a warm feeling of safety. The Majorats had successfully led them to Ghorrock. This man, along with many others, is a Zarosian refugee. So far, the undisputable loser of the God Wars was the Empire, and the destruction of many of its cities had created a large number of fleeing civilians. At some point, 2 Majorats still loyal to their side, Mizarch and Jalin, led a group of refugees to the northwestern corner of Forintry, taking refuge in the fortress of Ghorrock. As word spread of their successful journey, this faraway northern fortress would become a popular destination for Zarosians escaping the conflicts or seeking a new home. A very special guest even made their appearance, Duke Cecellus, now de facto commander of the Empire's forces. For the safety of the occupants, rules were tightened. They had no hope of relief in the event of a siege. The garrison and occupants had only one option: make themselves invisible. It was forbidden for anyone to leave the stronghold's underground complex to avoid attracting the attention of the enemy. As the population grew, life became more of a struggle. But it did go on. In fact, the walls of Ghorrock's underground complex would host many generations of Zarosians, most of which would never see the outside world. But, as with so many locations we've already explored, Ghorrock's luck would come to an end before the God Wars did, and I promise we will be tying up all those loose ends. The invasion of Hallowvale. Zamorak's return had allowed him to consolidate his sphere of influence. His most powerful backers had initially agreed to conspire with him against Zaros in exchange for the promise of land and titles. One Zamorakian was particularly eager to capitalize on his side's momentum. Loberniel Draken was a powerful Trueborn vampire who had joined Zamorak's plot in the Second Age. In a bold testament to the scale of his ambitions, he launched a full-scale surprise invasion of Hallowvale, wishing to carve out his own domain out of Saradomin's most important stronghold. An army of vampires and werewolves began pouring into the region. Ruled by Queen Efarite Hallow in what is today Mauritania, Hallowvale was a realm of men and Iceans, an ancient race of large humanoids with great wings adorning their backs. They were devoted Saradominists who had an innate affinity for light, a natural weakness of vampires. On top of that, they began creating weapons out of the logs of the great blisterwood tree, as they proved uniquely effective against the vampiric foes. The kingdom was no pushover, and the invasion force would have its work cut out for it. Casualties began rising quickly. Draken was openly unconcerned about heavy losses, painting the deaths as noble sacrifices for the cause. Their bloody advance continued relentlessly. It soon became clear that the kingdom's very survival might be at stake. As doubt began creeping into its inhabitants' consciousness, unprecedented measures were implemented. Their most sacred site was the Hallowed Sepulchre, a massive ancient crypt where the greatest figures of the kingdom and many members of its religious orders were buried, some of them with very powerful relics. Should the worst happen, its content could not fall to the enemy. The Archpriest of the Unicorn was responsible for the sepulchre. He and his followers would begin working alongside justiciars to create a labyrinthine series of traps and obstacles, denying entry to all but the most fearless or foolish. Meanwhile, the impetuous advance of the Zamorakians continued. Back then, the kingdom consisted of beautiful, fertile lands, a terrain ill-suited to defend against the doctrines of relentless assaults and high tolerance for casualties. After losing an eye-watering number of warriors, the attackers reached the southeastern part of Hallowvale, where most of the population lived. The kingdom was seemingly on its last legs. But Draken's armies were in a dire state thanks to his costly military style. Unable to do much more than siege and blockade what was left of the kingdom, he finally had to experiment with a new strategy: subterfuge. Enter Verzik Vita, head of the Vitter family. She had always been among Draken's closest and strongest allies. Working alongside Rhanis Draken, one of the 3 Draken brothers, she captured a justiciar and incessantly tortured the unfortunate soul. After many days of unthinkable suffering, their will was finally broken. They revealed the existence of a secret tunnel leading directly to the royal keep. The queen's castle was infiltrated through this back door and her husband, King Acertes, captured. He was a human, which was highly unusual in Hallowvale. Humans had long been seen as second-class citizens, and Nefarite's marriage to one of them had been a first in the history of House Hallow. When looting the coffins in the Hallowed Sepulchre, there's a 10% chance you will receive a page of the Strange Hallowed Tome, a book written by a man from Hallowvale who talks about his experience falling in love and marrying an Icene. He reveals that these mixed marriages are becoming normalized thanks to the Queen's own choice of spouse. He comments that his and his bride's families are worried about the union, and then he adds, and I quote, "I hope they stop asking about bedroom compatibility soon." To which all I can say is, if you've seen what Icenes look like, you too should be asking questions. But anyway, aside over. When she learned of her husband's capture, Queen Nefarite gave herself up, surrendering her kingdom to the vampires and only begging for her beloved husband's life to be spared in exchange. Tragically, mercy was not part of her usurper's vocabulary. What followed was a good demonstration of Lower Niel Draken's infamous cruelty. The Zamorakians needed to refill their ranks after the colossal losses they had suffered during the invasion, which prompted them to force many conquered humans to undergo vampirification, a process that would turn them into lesser vampires and warp their minds. They chose this very fate for King Acertes. As soon as he had fully turned, he adopted the vampiric name of Vanstrom Klaus and attempted to murder his own 2 children. Princess Larina fell to his hand, but his son Safalan barely escaped with his life. In the 5th Age, the prince would still be alive and leading the Myarchy. However, the brutal attempt on his life left him with amnesia, and therefore unaware of just how personal his cause truly was. As for the queen, it was believed for a long time that Draken had executed her and buried her remains in the Icene graveyard, until the revelation that her body was missing. While she is most likely long dead, there is still a chance she might be alive to this day. Lower Niel Draken may be the only one aware of her ultimate fate. Her surrender was interpreted by some of the highest-ranking justiciars as a sign that Saradomin had abandoned them. Justiciar Fozani defected with 2 of her companions, offering to enact an organized system of blood tithing on the human population to prove their allegiance and save their own skins. Their suggestion was well received by the vampires, and it is still in use to this very day. Loreniel Draken proclaimed that the fallen kingdom would henceforth be called Mauritania and become his domain. The northern ruins of Hallowvale were rebuilt into the prosperous vampire city of Darkmeia, while its south would become the sprawling human slum of Mayerditch, where the blood tithe system was implemented. It was split into sections, and the regular rotation of which one was designated for blood tithing ensured that the humans would not be drained to death and their blood supply would never run dry. As reward for their treachery, Fozani and her acolytes would be allowed to settle a small area at Mauritania's eastern edge. There, they founded the Sisterhood, a Zamorakian order that still survives to this day, in a tiny village now known as Sleep. House Vita was also handsomely rewarded for Verzik's invaluable contribution to the invasion. Queen Efarite's castle was renamed to Versinhaza and granted to her. Now sitting on its throne as Lady Verzik, she would become known for her love of extravagant entertainment, best embodied in the Theatre of Blood, an arena where both slaves and willing creatures would fight to the death for great rewards, including some items from her large collection of souvenirs from the invasion, such as armor pieces of the vanquished Justiciar Order. As for Loreniel, he adopted the title of Lord Draken and found the hiding place of the Stone of Jas. He moved it to a cave on the Dark Mayor, and, fun fact, the Dealt veins and deposits that exist there today were created thanks to the area being exposed to the stone's magical aura for much of the Third Age. Mauritania's new vampire overlords continued to consolidate and reshape their stolen kingdom. The magnificent landscapes and fertile fields were slowly turned into the desolate marshlands they look like today. The vampires and their werewolf allies imposed their will with an iron grip that would never really loosen. The Drakens are still the rulers of Mauritania today in the Fifth Age, and there is little hope of seeing the status quo change anytime soon. Humans still live in Mayerditch to serve as blood tithe offerings. Many of their homes are now more rot than wood, and even a short glance at the area paints a clear picture of suffering and unending struggle for survival. There was one place the vampires were never able to bend to their will, however: the Hallowed Sepulchre. The traps installed by the Archpriest of the Unicorn served their purpose so admirably that the Zamorakians eventually had to admit defeat and give up on their plan to loot its rich chambers. The Gargoyles come to life. Allow me to break the timeline slightly and take you to what is little more than a footnote of the God Wars, but an interesting one nonetheless. Sometime during the invasion of Hallowvale, while the Zamorakians and Saradominists in Hallowvale were too distracted by each other to watch over their own backyards, a small force of Bendosian troops crossed the river south and managed to slip undetected into the kingdom. Bandos intended to wage eternal war, but he saw many of his followers, notably goblins, as too weak and desired stronger soldiers. This little excursion was going to fix this issue. Under the command of an orc general called Snaldor, they had orders to venture into Vigorous Folly. Does that place ring any bells? If not, it will very soon. Near the end of the Second Age, the Sarosian general Vigora was tasked with overseeing the construction of a tower at the eastern edge of the realm. The purpose of this task has been lost to history. At this point, Vigora had already chosen to support Zamorak's scheming and used Zamorakian magic to assist the construction efforts. An unknown incident caused the tower to be abandoned and renamed Vigorous Folly, though this name would eventually be forgotten, replaced by the building's famous modern name, the Slayer Tower. Bandos knew about the tower's most iconic feature, the large number of intricately carved gargoyles decorating its winding corridors and large rooms. Those were the kind of creatures he needed to fill his ranks. From a black magical stone, he crafted a tourmaline core, then created an incantation ritual that, when powered by the core, would animate the gargoyles and turn them into his soldiers. The force made its way to the roof, where they found 2 oversized gargoyles. Snaldor was quite pleased with these soon-to-be soldiers and had his troops set up the ritual. In the book The Living Statues, we can read the memoirs of a Dorgeshuun who was selected to perform the ritual, as most other Bendosian creatures had no magical abilities. He recalls looking at the majestic statues and thinking that Dusk and Dawn would be fitting names for them due to their positioning on the western and eastern side of the room. The ritual called for them to play their part during high noon. Once it came, light hit the black tourmaline core, splitting it into 2 beams reflected onto the statues. Then, like an ice cube in boiling water, it sank into the floor. Only one final step remained. The bell was rung, reverberating throughout the massive structure surrounding the Bendosians. The sound was followed by a wave of dark energy filling the room. The ritual was complete. The 2 statues slowly animated, leaving their pedestals to join the group. Visibly delighted by the result, Snaldor gave them orders. They were to fight the forces of Saradomin, Armadil, and Zamorak, but it seemed Bandos had been unaware of the Zamorakian influence present in the tower. Upon hearing the name of the one responsible for their creation, they turned on Snaldor and his soldiers. The Orc commander managed to snap one of the gargoyles' wings off during the unexpected melee, but even he faltered once he had a split second to consider the large number of animated gargoyles now swarming the building and the strength of the 2 giants. He chose the sensible route of ordering immediate retreat. As they scurried away, the surviving Bendosians must have been relieved to see the gargoyles were not giving chase. In fact, vast numbers of them still roamed the foreboding rooms of the Slayer Tower today. As for the author of the Living Statues, he survived the failed mission and would become one of the many Dorgeshuun to desert Bandos. Still, his written accounts left an unexpected mark on the world. Most adventurers of the 5th Age have heard rumors of Dawn and the single-winged Dusk, the grotesque guardians that await those daring enough to journey to the tower's roof. The incident may have had a limited impact on the course of the 3rd Age, but its consequences have been visible ever since. The Barrows brothers and Saradominist Crusade. The unthinkable and total defeat of Hallowvale sent shockwaves around the world, shaking the Saradominists of Gielinor to the core. Their strongest realm was now controlled by Zamorak, but what could they do about it? A most unexpected answer would come one day when a mysterious stranger appeared in a small Mistland town. There, he would introduce himself to 6 young siblings and give them an interesting offer. They would receive powerful artifacts and deep arcane knowledge, so long as they agreed to serve the shadowy figure once they proved themselves worthy. The brothers must have been overcome with optimism. Here was a chance to rewrite the fate of Saradomin's kingdom. They left their village, traveling the land and gathering a large host of Saradominist warriors. The brothers' call resonated far and wide, and thousands committed their lives to the Mauritania campaign. The great host headed east until they crossed the Salve River, the same one that vampires and werewolves had crossed years ago. The Saradominist Crusade had begun. The 6 brothers quickly distinguished themselves as competent leaders and peerless fighters. The Crusaders' strategy was simple but effective. The brothers would personally take care of the enemy's strongest warriors, always coming out on top, while the rest of their host would engage the lesser troops. The Saradominists won a steady stream of decisive victories as they swept across the Mauritanian marshlands. Their morale was through the roof. They were invincible. Walking in their foes' footsteps, their impetuous advance continued. But as the optimistic army set camp one night, a strange hooded figure stood between the tents and campfires. They approached the campaign's leaders, and the sounds of festivities suddenly gave way to a pregnant silence as the brothers locked eyes with the guest. The mysterious stranger was standing there, seemingly uninterested in getting close enough for a conversation. Instead, his raspy voice suddenly echoed in the brothers' minds. The time has come, my warriors. The gifts I bestowed upon you have served you well, and you, in turn, have served your god. Now it is time to begin your servitude to me, to my god. You shall stand ever vigilant for his return, and then you will be champions in his glorious army. We shall have victory against the usurper, but first, you must die. Taken aback, the brothers instinctively gripped their weapons, but after a moment, the stranger simply turned on his heels and walked away until he vanished in the darkness beyond the camp, leaving it submerged in a tense, uneasy atmosphere. The incident quickly faded from the rank-and-file's consciousness, but their leaders would never be the same again. Where their minds had been unwavering and focused, they were now filled with doubt and dread. Nevertheless, the army pressed on. More battles came, but things seemed different. One could not help but notice the 6 heroes slowly losing their edge in battle. They grew slower, their strikes missed their marks, and they began receiving injuries. Something was distracting them as they fought. Every now and then they would catch glances of the mysterious stranger looking over the battlefield from afar, never pulling his gaze away from them. The Crusaders eventually reached the Mauritanian capital, pitching their camp a short distance west of Mayerditch. But that night, for the first time, the enemy would take them by surprise. Some of Lord Draken's forces quietly left Dark Mayor, crashing into the camp during the dead of night. The Saradominists bravely defended themselves, ultimately driving off the raiding force, but likely suffered the most casualties of any battle of the campaign thus far. When the morning came, it brought with it more bad news. All 6 of the army's leaders had been critically wounded. The day was spent attempting to stabilize them, but as the last lights of day died and gave way to darkness, so did they. The Crusaders despaired at the loss of their heroes, and the officers now in charge all agreed they had to abandon the siege. But first, they had to honor their fallen comrades. For 6 days and 6 nights, they dug the best resting place they could for them. Not once did the Zamorakians attack them, but every second of those days they spent mocking and taunting the Saradominists from the safety of their high walls. The brothers were buried in 6 barrows, earning them the name history would remember them as, the Barrows Brothers. Their army retreated, their morale and spirits thoroughly broken after that dreadful week. The burial had attracted the attention of an unseen observer. From the shadows, the mysterious stranger had witnessed the completion of the crypts with interest. When the retreating force had slipped from sight, he stood on the burial ground and performed an incantation in an old language, casting an ancient magic spell that bled through the ground and reanimated the brothers as dark phantoms. Ultimately, the only winner of the crusade was the mysterious stranger. He had raised 6 powerful soldiers for future use and weakened the forces of 2 enemy factions at once. It may not surprise you to learn that this elusive being was none other than our old friend Slisk. The crusade his latest machinations triggered had failed, and Mauritania would never again belong to followers of Saradomin. The Fall of Senntisten. Everyone has seen the archaeologists hard at work in the dig site. Some have even heard the rumors that they uncovered artifacts of some ancient god. But few are aware of just how incredible what lies deep beneath the earth used to be. At its peak, the settlement was bigger than nearby Ghorrock. In fact, it was bigger than the current undisputed queen of Gielinor cities, Prifdidus. During its rise in the Second Age, it became the largest city and would retain that title for millennia. Sadly, a mighty rise often means a mighty fall. As the Third Age progresses into its endgame, it's time to explore a microcosm of the crumbling empire's decline, as the Zarosian capital and history's greatest city, Senntisten, is finally taken by the enemy. Unfortunately for such a historically significant event, we know next to nothing about how exactly the city fell. At this point of the God Wars, it seems the Zarosian Empire still controlled its capital and everything south of it. but most of that was arid desert with little strategic value. As for the northern half of the realm, we know that many areas of Misthalin and Forinthree provinces had long since been lost, so it's likely that what remained was a collection of scattered fortresses and strongholds. Under these conditions, Senntisten was doomed to fall sooner or later. Of the battle itself, all we know is that it was Zamorakian forces that initially occupied the city, intending to subjugate its population. However, they steadfastly refused to be assimilated by the Zamorakians, who eventually had to give up on the idea. They instead began a long process of completely destroying the sprawling metropolis. The population was met with a tough reality, having to pick between three equally distasteful destinies. Some simply chose to remain and resist the occupation until they were killed or no longer had any place to call home there. Others fled to the desert, which so far had been spared by the worst of the conflict, but where life was tough, and getting lost meant almost certain death at the hand of the cruel heat. The last option was to flee north and hope to reach one of the few remaining Zarosian strongholds without getting killed or captured in enemy territory. Eventually, Senttisten's entire population was either refugee or casualty. The city itself was unrecognizable behind its mask of destruction. It's likely that few Zamorakians remained to occupy this devastated landscape, and Saradomin decided to capitalize on this opportunity. A force of his followers attacked the ruins and drove off their occupiers. Once secured, Saradominist settlers were sent there to build a whole new city, seemingly to erase all traces of its Zarosian history. This new city was christened Saranthium, and it was built and populated in record times, as it is now remembered as a magnificent Third Age city, despite having been founded less than 300 years before its end. If you've ever helped cleaning finds for the Varrock Museum, you may have run into several ancient mundane items marked with Saradomin's symbol. It's a testament to the Saradominist dedication to destroying Zarosian influence in the area that the modern archaeological finds are almost exclusively related to Saranthium rather than the much more long-lived capital of the ancient world. Using ancient magic to teleport to Senntisten today places you near the fence west of the exam center, where few adventurers ever stop to marvel at the rich history behind this now unremarkable area. Skotizo's betrayal and Zalcano's curse. Many Zarosians who fled north during the Fall of Senntisten chose to take shelter at the fortress of Karalengar in Forinthree province, located on today's Graveyard of Shadows. But if these refugees thought this stronghold would escape the fate of the capital, they were unfortunately mistaken. Soon after the destruction of Senntisten, Zamorak and Saradomin exploited their momentum and turned their attention northwards. No accounts of Karalengar's occupation and subsequent destruction survive, but we do know about a Zamorakian distinguishing themselves during the event. Meet Skotizo, a demon you may be familiar with. During the Third Age, he was one of Zamorak's generals, but it is said he was always outshined by others such as Thamaron and Krill Tsutsuroth. However, during the Battle of Karalengar, Skotizo and his soldiers apparently displayed great cunning, enough for Zamorak himself to take notice. Following the battle, he personally gave Skotizo his next assignment, which was an unusual honor. The ecstatic general, thrilled by this opportunity, set out with a small force. His destination? The Karamjan temple hidden in the Karazi jungle. It contained a powerful artifact Zamorak was eager to get his hands on. But don't get too excited, we never actually find out what this item is. Skotizo's squad managed to navigate the jungle and find the temple after a few days. The large maze and numerous traps inside failed to keep them away from the treasure within. Yet no sooner had Skotizo touched the artifact that a switch seemed to flip in him. Whether it was because of his deep-seated resentment and greed, or if the artifact itself took hold of his mind, we may never know. But no matter the reason, he turned on his squad before they had time to react. Near the southwest corner of the temple's maze, the remains of a long-dead member of the expedition can still be found. This unfortunate soul was called Malumak, which we know because a careful search of the skeleton leads to the discovery of Malumak's journal. It speaks of Skotizo's unexpected treachery. Malumak himself attempted to escape the demon's onslaught, only to be severely injured by a mace trap and deciding to reveal the betrayal in his journal as a last act before his wounds got the better of him. Once he was informed, Zamorak was overcome by rage. He quickly turned to one of his remaining generals as the target for his fury, Skotizo's sister Zalcano. He blamed her for her brother's actions, asserting her guilt by association. As punishment, he ordered her to bring both Skotizo and the artifact back, and cast a powerful curse on her that would slowly turn her body to stone. Completing her task was the only cure for the curse. As it was generally agreed that Skotizo had fled west, Zalcano had a good idea of where he may be hiding. She made for Tirranon, the elven lands that had remained untouched by the Great Wars for thousands of years at that point. The presence of a demon general in their pristine lands did not go unnoticed by the Elves, and panic quickly spread through Wilderness, as it was assumed the intruder was merely the first hint of an approaching army. But dread quickly turned to confusion when it became clear that Zalcano was in fact alone and merely roaming the dense forests as if searching for something. Soon enough, the Elves found out about the curse turning her to stone and decided to capture the lone enemy for study. One of Wilderness's large caves was transformed into a special prison so she could be kept within the city. Once ready, the Elves sent a contingent to capture their strange visitor. Even with parts of her body turned to stone, they took many casualties attempting to subdue the demon, though they ultimately succeeded in bringing Zalcano to her custom prison. The Elves used various potions and spells to unveil the mystery of her presence in their lands. The curse's effect visibly grew after her capture, with some theorizing it might be due to Zamorak already being aware of her failure to complete his orders. Madness began slowly taking hold in the prisoner's mind, but due to the lives lost in her capture, the Elves refused to risk freeing her. She still remains confined in her cave, where Elves to this day hire the help of adventurers to keep her contained, as her impressive powers are dangerous even with her entire body being covered in a dense layer of stone. But perhaps the most tragic part of her tale is that her fate was sealed from the beginning. Skotizo had indeed fled west to escape Zamorak's wrath, but never did stop in Tirranon. Instead, he traveled overseas and hid underground, where he used the power of his stolen artifact to call many dangerous creatures to his side. He cast an enchantment on their dark caves to prevent his new minions from ever escaping. Their hiding place became the catacombs of Kourend, where Skotizo resides to this day, still hiding from a god that has long since left Gielinor, although it is likely he does not realize it. The Desert Campaign. On the western edge of the Caridian Desert lies a tiny innocuous settlement. To the wide world, the small patch of arid desert is known as the Bandit Camp. It is seen by many as little more than a remote haven for criminals, yet visitors of this corner of Gielinor are most often treated decently by the small population. That is, unless they are displaying visible signs of Saradominist or Zamorak worship. This is because the desert bandits remember something the rest of the world does not. They remember Zaros, and they remember what happened to their ancestors. Adventurers looking for a certain desert treasure may have met one of these bandits, a man called Eblis. To those who would hear him out, he sometimes speaks of his tribe's ancient history. The spiteful Saradomin and pathetic Zamorak warred with each other, but the hatred they had for each other was as nothing to the hatred they held towards us. With each battle they waged, we lost more and more land, unable to fight on all fronts, and were pushed further and further south into this god-forsaken desert. After the falls of Karalengar and Senntisten, the Zarosian Empire was truly in tatters. The only remaining areas of relative safety were the vast, desolate expanses of the Caridian desert. Saradominists and Zamorakians alike had had little reason to send expeditions there, but things had changed. They had an enemy to exterminate, and they were not about to leave the job unfinished. Both factions sent excursions south and united their strength to deal with the only remaining great Zarosian threat. Azanadra, the Empire's Pontifex Maximus, meaning its High Priest. Azanadra was a Majorat of incredible power, who had single-handedly defeated enemy armies crossing into the desert. Just like Nex, he was seen as an invincible foe, and just like Nex, they believed imprisonment was the better way to deal with him. As was to be expected, the plan cost them many lives, but they ultimately succeeded in trapping Azanadra in an ancient pyramid known as known as this word on the screen right now, which meant Tomb of Magic in some old desert language. With the use of great spells, his power was split and bound to 4 diamonds. There was now no speed bump left to slow down the rampaging armies in the desert. It's likely the rest of the desert campaign was mainly spent hunting down the few remaining Zarosians, but little information survives about this. We do know the alliance of Saradominists and Zamorakians was a temporary one, as Zamorak's troops ended up attacking and destroying Yuza, a city aligned with Saradomin. And I want to dedicate some time to Yuza, because I believe its fate is one of the most tragic parts of the Third Age, despite being one of the least well known. At this point in our story, Yuza was one of the very few truly prosperous cities of the Caridian desert, and its culture was among the most extraordinary in Gielinor's history. Their civilization was tiny, but remarkable for many reasons. For starters, they were the first, and as far as I can tell, only masters of the field of magical crafting. They were known as being the only city to create and use magically infused clay golems, and there is evidence of their religious practices being uniquely nuanced and varied. One of the few remaining features of the city is its buried temple, which reveals through its carvings that the inhabitants, while being aligned with Saradomin, used to openly worship other gods such as Zamorak to a certain degree, a rare characteristic in the Third Age. Little else is known about Yuza, but what little information survived makes me crave for more, and I do hope we uncover more at some point. Okay, back to its unfortunate destruction. The Zamorakian force approaching the city was led by the demon Thameron, Zamorak's chief lieutenant. He ordered a first assault, which was soundly defeated by the city's golem defenders. Undeterred, Thameron opted for a change in strategy. He traveled to Infernus, the collective term for the home world of the demons, the infernal dimensions. There, he went to his throne room, where he opened a portal leading directly to Yuza's on the city, behind its great temple. The plan worked, but at a cost. The city was utterly devastated, but the Zamorakians suffered enormous casualties as well. Thameron himself was so badly wounded in the battle that he opted to retreat to his throne room, where he would end up succumbing to his injuries. Curiously, his skeleton can still be found there, even though demons usually only leave ashes behind. Some theorize that the manner of his death caused this. Others hypothesize this might be as a result of him dying within Infernus. But my own opinion is, this was just an oversight by Jagex when the quest of Golem was made. The Zamorakian onslaught did not stop at Yuza. They continued south, laying waste to everything in their path with little regards for things like allegiances. Today, the southeastern corner of the desert is composed of the ruins of Ulek, a once prosperous desert city. There, inside an old well, lies an ancient stone tablet with carvings from the Third Age. The Zamorakians are coming. We have no quarrel with them, but they won't care. We are already preparing our defenses. But should Ulek fall, we can't let them defile Skabaras's precious artifacts. In the end, Ulek was another mostly forgotten victim of the desert campaign, despite being neutral towards the main God Wars factions. The city was invaded by the forces of Balfrog Kriath, a black demon who you may know as one of Krill Tsutsaroth's bodyguards today. Little else is known about the Desert Campaign, but it is my opinion that it's one of the most tragic phases of an already tragic age. For societies to thrive in the harsh Caridian desert, they had to be advanced and sophisticated. Almost all of these fascinating locations were completely wiped out, whether or not they even had any interest in the wider conflicts. Who knows how many awe-inspiring settlements have been forgotten, their existence now reduced to nothing more than ruins, covered in layers upon layers of shifting sands. Ghorrock Part 2: The Duke's Madness. The Zarosian Empire had been brought to its knees. Nothing was left of the once formidable realm, and those still loyal to Zaros had to resort to hiding in the hostile desert just to avoid dying at the hand of their enemies. Yet the fallen empire still had one stronghold, a place that remained as well hidden in the late Third Age as it was when we first visited it many chapters ago. In the northwestern corner of Forinthree, Ghorrock's underground was still untouched by the war. Millennia after it had become a haven for refugees, it had been expended as much as it could be and was now severely overpopulated. The de facto Zarosian leader, Duke Zacelis, still ruled this secret micro-kingdom, but as the situation deteriorated, so did his mind. It seems insanity slowly took hold of Zacelis. He moved his quarters to the prison asylum and became obsessed with patently unrealistic delusions of restoring the empire, ordering preparations for an eventual military sortie. Dark rumors began circulating around Ghorrock, as some claimed that those who were summoned to the Duke's quarters seldom returned. Those suspicions eventually grew too evident to ignore. The Duke had gone utterly mad and had begun eating his subjects to absorb their power. Jalan and Mizark, the two Mazurats who, you might recall, had brought the first wave of refugees to Ghorrock in the early Third Age, scrambled to organize a rapid escape from the Forsaken Fortress. Mere hours later, Zarosian faithfuls emerged to its surface for the first time in thousands of years. During the evacuation, the Mazurats sealed the prison, trapping Zacelis and many unfortunate souls inside. The only key to breaking the seal, the Ghorrock crest, was split in half. Each of them kept a piece, and they went their separate ways. We don't know what happened to those who evacuated the fortress, but with nowhere left to go to, enemies dotting the land, and, for many, no experience of the surface at all, it's likely the rest of their lives was anything but pleasant. As for Duke Zacelis, he stayed deep within the old prison until he ran out of anything to sustain him. To conserve his strength, he fell into a protracted hibernation-like state that would last until the Fifth Age. His body is now completely unlike its pre-madness depictions, probably thanks to the Zarosians he had absorbed. But one thing has not changed. The fourth and last medallion to the ancient vault is still somewhere on the grotesque mass he now inhabits. The God Wars moved to their endgame, the God Sword. War had been a grim constant on Gielinor for almost 4,000 years at this point, but the winds of change were beginning to blow. For the first time since the beginning of the Third Age, keen observers and the powers that be were witnessing something new. The end of the God Wars was in sight. The despised Zarosians had been all but wiped out, but now the Zamorakian tide had already engulfed much of the continent and was showing no signs of stopping. Its opponents were coming to terms with a grim reality. Zamorak was winning. His power and armies were growing, and something had to be done. And so, something was done. A tenuous alliance was formed between Saradomin, Bandos, and Armadil as they realized their forces had to be united to overcome Zamorak. They came up with a plan. Their armies would launch a combined attack, and to ensure victory, they would create a secret weapon. This project would result in the creation of a legendary item under the veil of secrecy, the Godsword. The Grand Combined Army set out for Forentry, which had become the heart of Zamorak's formidable realm. It seems the defenders were caught off guard by the attack, as they were quickly pushed back. As the attackers advanced, work on the Godsword was completed, and a group of Armadel's aviancies were tasked with delivering the weapon to the allied armies. However, it appears Zamorakian intelligence had somehow uncovered the project, as the aviancies were ambushed by a demon army in the mountains west of Forentry. The transport unit could not allow the enemy to get their hands on the Godsword, and so they fled to a nearby cave, hoping to mount a defense until reinforcements could arrive. Upon learning of these developments, the forces knew they had to act fast. Barrows and Saradominist each sent a large detachment west to the mountains to help the Armadillians. As it turned out, the cave the aviancies had taken refuge in was the Temple of Lost Ancients, where Nex and her army were imprisoned at the very beginning of the Third Age. The Bendosians and Saradominists arrived in the nick of time. They joined forces with Armadel's soldiers, tilting the balance against the demons. But as the battle raged on, cracks began to appear in the fragile alliance. Old grudges and mistrust slowly chipped at it until it finally shattered. The winning side collapsed into confused infighting, and the entire battle devolved into a chaotic four-way struggle for the Godsword. All four sides must have sent further reinforcements, as the battle raged on until the mighty weapon they were fighting for was broken into several pieces that ended up in different parts of the battlefield. Yet the battle still would not end, and the former allies continued to be at each other's throat for a long time. Which, for once, leads us directly to the next chapter. Nex's Prison, Part 2. As the melee continued in the temple, a group of Saradomin priests involved in the combat grew wary of the fighting and became disillusioned by what they probably saw as pointless bloodshed. Their hearts were deeply torn by the horrors of the unending God Wars, but what choice did they really have in the matter besides continuing to fight for their god? Yet, unexpectedly, an alternative would come to them one day when a fellow priest approached them, having noted their misgivings. The man confessed having turned away from Saradomin, having embraced Guthixian teachings instead. The priests were intrigued, and as they learned more about Gielinor's slumbering deity, they slowly strayed from Saradomin. Over time, they became dedicated Guthixians, completely renouncing their old allegiances. Sometime later, their new mentor told them about how his research into his new faith had led him to an ancient druidic ritual that could allow them to awaken Guthix himself from his millennia-spanning sleep. The ritual had been too advanced for him to perform alone, but he believed they could pull it off together. The group's hope was rekindled. Surely a being as powerful and just as Guthix would end the madness of the God Wars and snatch peace back from the talons of Gielinor's warhawks. They set to work without delay, their sense of purpose shining brighter than ever before. They followed the Guthixians' instructions to the letter and with pounding hearts performed the ritual. In essence, it was a success. They had awoken an incomprehensibly powerful being. But they soon realized that being was not Guthix. Deep inside the Temple of Lost Ancients, near the secluded area they had chosen for the ritual, ice began melting. The Guthixians were filled with dread as they looked upon what they had unleashed. Beyond the newly unsealed passage stood a dazed and weakened, but very much alive Zarosian army, along with their commander, Nex. The newly freed prisoner turned to the Guthixian's mentor, addressing him in a language his followers could not understand. But one of the former priests, a human woman named Ashwelet Reis, did catch a little something of the conversation. The man who she now realized had tricked them, Nex referred to as Slisk. She had little time to make sense of these unforeseen events before the Zarosians escaped and killed her. Finding the main room of the temple filled with enemies, Nex did not hesitate to jump into the fray. The surprised armies fighting for the Godsword suffered devastating losses, unable to best this new and yet old opponent. In an almost comical case of history repeating itself, all four sides quickly formed a temporary alliance against their common foe. Through their combined efforts, they managed to push the Zarosians back into the ancient prison and seal its entrance, although they could not replicate the original enchantment that froze them there. As a result, Nex and her troops would be sealed away yet again, but no longer in a dormant state. Possibly as a side effect of the ritual, Ashuella's race returned as a nature spirit, neither fully alive nor dead, and was bound to the entrance of the ancient prison. Today, she is still stuck inside of it, where she provides all the limited help she can to any adventurers willing to help contain the being she mistakenly unleashed upon the world. As for the Temple of Lost Ancients, its original prisoners had been freed, and that called for a new, more accurate name, and thus the area was renamed the God Wars Dungeon. The wilderness is born as Guthix awakens. The Alliance had broken down in the God Wars dungeon, but the situation on the outside had not changed. The forces of Armadil, Saradominist and Barrows, even without access to their special weapon, still continued their gambit, pushing ever deeper into Forinthree in an attempt to encircle Zamorak before the full might of his armies could reinforce his position. Zamorak was cornered, his enemies slowly tightening their grip. Accounts differ on whether Zamorak had the Stone of Jas moved to Forinthree at some point, or if it remained in Darkmeyer and he had absorbed some of its power. But whatever the case may be, Zamorak resorted to a truly desperate measure to deal with the incoming threat. Either striking the stone or channeling its immense power, he triggered the single most destructive event in Gielinor's history as he unleashed an incomprehensibly huge explosion. In a mere instant, the green and luscious expanses of Forinthree evaporated, leaving nothing but a desolate post-apocalyptic landscape behind. The armies of his enemies, as well as his own, were wiped off the map before they knew what hit them. From the northern edge of Senttisten's ruins all the way to the forsaken fortress of Ghorrock, all that remained of Forinthree, Gielinor's largest province, was charred hills and scattered ruins. Forinthree was no more. The wilderness was born. Living beings on Gielinor have always been tied to a mysterious entity called the Anima Mundi, often described as the very life force of this world. The connection to it is what allows plants to grow, animals to breathe, and aquatic creatures to swim. Some beings, such as spirit trees, are particularly close to it. But at that moment, the scale of death and destruction caused the Anima Mundi itself to cry out in agony. This call resonated far and wide, even reaching deep beneath the earth, where it found the ear of Gielinor's oldest resident. Like a sleeping parent hearing the faraway cry of an infant, Guthix was pulled away from his millennia-long slumber. He emerged on the surface, where he laid eyes on the destruction and mishandling of the world he loved so dearly. Horrified by the sight, he and his followers decided to intervene. All other gods were banished from Gielinor, and henceforth were only allowed to influence it through indirect means, most famously through prayers. Thus, the Edicts of Guthix were established, a somewhat unclear series of decrees imposed on the gods. In essence, the edicts say that should the balance between order and chaos be upset by either side once again, Guthix would come back again and reshape the world into one of perfect balance, even if its complete destruction was necessary to attain it. Once the edicts were put in place, the God Wars dungeon and the armies within are then frozen, allegedly by an unknown Guthix follower, although according to my research we don't really know how it happened. With those responsible for thousands of years of strife gone, Guthix then meets with the only other god remaining on Gielinor, Saren, goddess of the Elves. Their race had a unique connection with her, and their existence was reliant on hers. Saren knew her departure from Gielinor would be a death sentence for her people, and she begged Guthix to stay, but her pleas fell on deaf ears. As with Zamorak, a desperate move was needed to achieve her goals. The deity shattered herself in pieces, surrendering her own life so that her body could at least remain in Gielinor and continue to sustain the Elves' lives. Most adventurers today are familiar with the various kinds of crystal seeds abundant in Tiranon, but you may be surprised to learn that all of them are remains of Saren, tiny leftovers from her sacrifice. Finally, once Guthix was the only god left on Gielinor, he confiscated the Stone of Jas, hiding it deep underground and building the ancient Guthixian temple to house it. He would also create the Balance Elemental to ensure its protection. His job was done. The God Wars were over. The Tears of Guthix and the end of the Third Age. Guthix, grief-stricken by the destruction of the God Wars, traveled the land to assess the damages in more details. He witnessed the extermination of desert civilizations, the ruins of too many cities to keep track, the extinction of a number of species including some aligned to him, the war refugees who chose horrific living conditions over involvement in the war, the luscious lands of Forentry and Hallowvale, now reduced to the smoldering expanses of the wilderness and the desolate marshes of Mauritania. The world he had first populated was utterly ravaged and would never fully recover. When this realization dawned on him, he found a forlorn corner of Misthalin, a dark underground cave, and simply wept. His sorrow infused the area, and the very cave he stood in began weeping as well. The cave where Guthix hid has yet to stop weeping. A rather strange follower of Guthix has made its entrance their home, and adventurers who manage to ingratiate themselves with this vigil may be allowed to gather some of the sacred tears of Guthix. Guthix eventually left the cave. Both himself and the world needed to heal, and so he went back to a second long slumber, one he has yet to awaken from. At long last, the God Wars were history. Well, that was a summary of the God Wars, or at least what we know about them so far. I'm gonna be honest, when I set out to make a lore video about them, I figured, hey, I've been building up my knowledge of this game for literally most of my life, and there probably isn't that much documented stuff about the Third Age, so this is gonna be a short, easy video. As you can probably tell, both assumptions could not have been more wrong. The research alone took about 25 hours, and that was before a single word of this over 13,000 words beast of a script was written. So if you liked it, please consider liking, subscribing and sharing the video. It would mean a lot to me, and it really is the best way to let me know you'd like more of that stuff, and to help the channel. I already have ideas cooking for other interesting lore videos, although you can bet your twisted bow the next one will be shorter and smaller in scope. Writing and researching the script really highlighted the depth and nuance I didn't know were present in the game's lore. It's not as simple as my primary school self believed. Saradomin good and Guthix's balance is all well and good, but after learning how Saradomin was happy to send his followers to their doom to grab territory and enact vengeance on his enemies, and how Guthix forced Saren into the worst fate of any gods, despite her being pretty much the only one interested in peace and the protection of life, to say nothing of how he threatened to destroy the entire world if other gods shaped it into something he didn't like, I'm left with a bit of a bad taste in my mouth. In the end, I'm glad I did this deep dive into an interesting story that Jagex actually bothered writing, despite knowing full well that most people would just spacebar their way through it, then complain to their clanmates about how much of a chore quests are. I, for one, enjoy a good story, and I'm going to pay more attention next time I do quests or I'm exposed to plot elements. But anyway, enough with the rambling. If you've watched all the way to this point, you have my deepest thanks and you're incredibly handsome. Let me know your thoughts and feedback in the comments, and if you'd like to see something goofy and completely different, why not check out my Gielinor Investigator series? It's about an investigator in Gielinor. Thanks again, and hopefully I'll see you in the next one. My cats will see you out.